Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a nice morning so far. My name is Dana Dabous. I'd like to welcome you all to this event hosted by the Edge Foundation to discuss what the future of FE may look like. We've initially set out this event after publishing our plan for FE report back in May, bringing together some research from the sector and outlining key debates with contributions from key stakeholders in the sector, some of which are speaking today. And since then, we know a lot has changed because of COVID and school and college lockdowns. So today we believe further education has been provided with the opportunity to redefine itself. We've already seen many initiatives coming together and getting started, highlighting the essential role FE can play in the economic and social revival post-COVID. We can say there's a spotlight on FE at the moment, especially with the upcoming FE white paper. And so at Edge, we would like to keep the discussion and dialogue going to help drive forward a new agenda for FE, learning from the different experiences across the four nations at this time. We have a great set of speakers and panel members today, with Julia Belgute from TES chairing this event. So please do use the Q&A function to write your questions for the panel discussion. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and I hope you enjoyed today's event. I'd like to pass it on now to the chair of the Edge Foundation, Neil Bates.
Well, thank you, Dana, and good morning, colleagues, and welcome to this webinar. My name, as Dana said, is Neil Bates, and I have the privilege of being chairman of the Edge Foundation and also the privilege of opening this event today, which is focused on the future of FE. This event could hardly come at a more important time for our nation. We have, as a backdrop to this webinar, a global pandemic which has devastated lives, communities, businesses, and our economy. We have the prospect of Brexit, which will on its own challenge businesses to raise productivity to compete in global markets. And we have seismic shifts in technology, which will demand new jobs, new skills, and new ways of working. Against these backdrops, the role of FE in supporting individuals and communities to succeed, in helping businesses to attract and train the talent they need, and the role of FE in tackling inequality and promoting social mobility have never been more important as our country seeks to recover, to rebuild, and to build back better for a brighter future. So our plan for FE, published by Edge earlier this year, sought to stimulate a debate about the future of further education. The report was commissioned by our superb research department led by Olly and authored by Dr. Dana Dabous, Ria Patel, and Chris Percy. In chapter 1 of the report, we seek to explore and explain the highly complex and diverse FE system in different parts of the UK. It highlights the struggles within the sector to define the place and the mission of FE within the wider education and skills system. It maps the relentless march of policy intervention, funding reforms, and commissions of inquiry which have sought to try and define the purpose of FE and its contribution to skills, the economy, and to social mobility. In chapter 2 of the report, we listen to the views, the experience, and the wisdom of sector leaders throughout the four nations of the UK. And in chapter 3, we shine a light on excellence within the FE sector, of which there is much, showcasing the fantastic work that colleges, providers, and trainers do. And then finally, we draw together the conclusions and just 3 recommendations. The first is that we establish more clarity about the overall mission and purpose of FE. The second, that we focus on the FE workforce, on how we attract, we reward, and we develop the very best teachers and make teaching in FE a prestigious career of choice for all. And then thirdly, we call on all four nations and all providers of all types to work together more collaboratively for a national effort to support people, communities, and businesses across the UK at this difficult time. This webinar, of course, is also timely, not least because of the announcements today, but also because of the imminent publication of the FE white paper. I'm absolutely delighted that we have 2 high quality, expert, and charismatic sector leaders as our presenters today. David Hughes, Chief Executive of the AOC, and Marie-Therese McGovern, the former Principal and Chief Executive of Belfast Metropolitan College. And they're supported by an expert panel who will follow the presentations by our two colleagues. And here to chair this event is Julia Belguti. She's the head of FE at TES. Many of you will know Julia well. Unfortunately, I have to leave for another engagement, but I'm really looking forward to hearing the outcomes from the webinar in what is such a crucial subject at such a crucial time for all of us as we seek to move forward after such a difficult time and put FE back in the limelight as a major contributor to economic development and community development as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Julia, who is going to steer us through the rest of the webinar today. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Neil. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for that introduction. My name is indeed Julia Belguti, and I'm the head of FE at TES. I've had the pleasure of covering FE and skills across the UK now for the best part of a decade, although at times it feels quite a bit longer. I'm based in Scotland, so I'm quite aware of the different experiences of colleges in the different nations over the last few years, and this year in particular, as they've dealt with the coronavirus pandemic. I was also born and raised in Germany, and so I know a few things about that famous German system that the Education Secretary in England is so keen on. The last few months have certainly been very busy for us at TES, and FE has very much been in the spotlight. It seems that FE has certainly been talked about much more now than it maybe ever has. And right now in particular, it's being talked about as a sector that can provide that path for economic recovery post-COVID. I think the speech that we're expecting later today from Boris Johnson is probably just the latest example of this. I'll now pass you on to our first speaker of the morning, David Hughes, the Chief Executive of the AOC, for his thoughts on what FE should look like. Off you go, David.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks for that introduction. It's great to be here. Really pleased that we're having this discussion. Just one housekeeping issue. I just need to share my screen if I can, and I've not got permission to do that. So if someone can try and sort that out.
David, I think I've just given you.
Yeah, you have. Sorry, apologies. It's just come through. Yeah, I mean, it is an amazing day to be doing this session. So, you know, that was very prescient of whoever decided on this day, because hopefully you've picked up that the Prime Minister's making a speech today in the Southwest about a big announcement about the National Skills Fund, which we know was part of the election manifesto announced in the March budget, but really clearly setting out an important role for further education, and that's really good news. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But we've been asked this kind of big, exciting question: what should the future of further education look like? And there's already a question about why we use the term further education, which I think is quite a good question, actually. And I think it is quite confusing. My preference is always to talk about institutions and what they do and their mission and purpose. And there's a lot of of leeway in terms of names. So lots of universities do an enormous amount of level 4-5 technical education, and lots of colleges do a lot of higher education at level 6. Lots of ITPs do the same. Adult ed does an enormous amount of breadth of offer. So actually what we should be talking about is institutional missions, I think. But look, I've got, I think, 15 or 20 minutes, and I want to try and set out what my view is. I've been in this game for a long time, and I genuinely think we're at one of the best places we've been for probably since Blunkett's kind of learning age document back in the late 90s. If some of you, I know some of you can remember that. It feels like we've gone through the worst decade, certainly in England, in terms of funding and austerity and so on. And now we're just about at a point where I think some good things are going to come, and I'll try and explain a bit about that. So what does the future need to be? I mean, more than anything, our sector needs to be bigger and better and bolder. You know, it's bigger because it gets more investment, bigger because the government understands what its role is, bigger because our society values it more, bigger because employers invest in it as well. Better because it needs to really, really understand what people need, what employers need, what places need. It needs to be less fettered and constrained by government rules set in Whitehall, and better able to meet local needs, people's needs, employers' needs, communities' needs. And it needs to be bolder. You know, one thing I've tried to do since I've been at AOC is to make this sector feel better about itself, be more confident, understand how important its role is, be confident and celebrate what it already does. So, and I think that's what's happened in the last few years. And I do think that's a major reason why the sector is in a much better place than it has been for a long time, that we've been flexing our kind of muscle a bit more. We've been demanding to be taken more seriously, and it's actually starting to happen. We're not there yet, and I'll come to that in a minute. But not only bigger, better and bolder, because that would be nice, but absolutely central to the recovery. And the recovery isn't just about kind of turning back to where we were. It's actually about renewal. It's about thinking about what does the economy need to look like in the future, understanding how that will be delivered by people with skills at all levels, but absolutely skilled people with opportunities to move on. It's got to be central to the levelling up agenda that this government has nailed to the absolute kind of mast of its principles and its approach, you know, delivering on levelling up for people who have been perhaps left behind, another phrase, the forgotten 50% perhaps, which was more a Labour rather than Conservative kind of ambition. But levelling up places as well as people, levelling up the places that have been left behind, you know, the kind of places like Oldham and Yarmouth and Hastings and Bolton and Bradford and so on, those sorts of places where the Conservatives did really well in the election. And we've got to think about how colleges are going to be central to that. But it's not just about economy and jobs, it's also about social inclusion. It's about better growth, it's about good jobs, it's about getting people out of poverty through good work and progression in work. And it is more than anything, I think, going to have to be based around productivity, because if through college skills and support and advice, SMEs can really move their productivity dial up, that improves the economy, of course it does, and it improves the tax take of government, which is helpful, but it also improves wages. And if we can get wages up, we can tackle the social exclusion, the poverty that is rife in all sorts of parts of our society. The other thing that we need further education to be is to be just absolutely seen as vital parts of both the education system and national infrastructure. And I think there's a way to go on this. You know, we've raised the profile, we've got much more into the kind of minds of politicians and even the media and policymakers, but we're still, as a sector, not seen as vital parts of the education system. There's still all sorts of prejudice, which I'll come back to in a minute. And in terms of national infrastructure, it is just bizarre, isn't it? Boris Johnson was talking a couple of months ago about build, 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 and loads of money coming in from government. And there wasn't actually loads of money, but there was some. And there will be more money spent on infrastructure, transport, housing, kind of retrofitting houses to make them more green, etc. But there was no mention of skills in that. I mean, it's just bizarre, isn't it? We think we're going to spend our way through capital to stimulate the economy, but we don't know who will build the buildings and retrofit the houses and lay the pipes and the train tracks and so on. And yet we're working with the Construction Leadership Council, who are really worried about where they're going to find the people they need and really want to work with us and with government now to start setting out the pathways. You know, so national infrastructure isn't just about capital spend, it's about people as well. The other thing that further education needs to be is confident, I've talked about, but confident based on resilience and financial security. Because if nothing else, what we've seen in the last decade is an absolute decimation of the funding, both in overall terms, but also in terms of the rate for the job, which really has undermined margins, it's undermined resilience, it's undermined stability. And we also need all of this because in the end, it's about impact. You know, there's no point just having a sector that's strong and resilient. It has to be making an impact. And I really like the Commission on the College for the Future's vision around people, productivity and place. You know, if we can deliver on that, if we can really make sure that people are getting the skills, support, advice they need, that productivity is being addressed, and that places are being developed holistically, then I think we're going to have a further education sector to be proud of. And then to achieve that, we need to be trusted, we need to be supported, and we need to be invested in. But there's an enormous way to go. There is really a long way. There's a big legacy. This is a sector which has been grossly underfunded for the last decade at least. And we've had a decade of austerity. Our work on colleges shows that there's about a 30% cut in real terms to colleges over the last decade. I mean, 30% over 10 years. There's been a massive reduction in adult spending. So the adult education budget that I used to manage when I was in the Learning Skills Council back in the noughties has more than halved in cash terms. But in real terms, that means a really reduced number of opportunities for adults, and not just reduced in number, but also reduced in breadth. So the amount of funding that goes to support young people, for instance, gives them 14 or 15 hours of teaching a week in England. In most of the OECD, it's 25 to 30 hours. In terms of adults, the Auger report showed that the average spend in HE is 6,000+. In FE, it's around about £1,000. I mean, it's a massive difference. But it's not just underfunded, it's also misunderstood. I still kind of wince at the way some politicians and some officials try to discuss and describe this sector. They don't get it, they don't understand it. It's not in their DNA, it's not part of their experience often. And because of that, I think it's badly misunderstood. And the misunderstanding, I think, leads to this kind of sort of sense that it's like a toy set that you can play with, that politicians and policymakers can tinker around in a very, I think, amateurish way. If you don't understand something, then you really shouldn't interfere. But there's lots of interference in our sector, and there has been for decades. Politicians and policymakers who think it's simple, people who think that a college is a big school, people who think that just tinkering with this rule or that rule will make changes. People who think that if you've had a bad experience at school, all you need to do is be given an offer and everything will change. There's some real simplistic thinking. So we end up, I think, and have ended up with really poor policy. And policy that's not well thought through, that's siloed, that isn't holistic, that doesn't think about behaviours and the way people understand their own learning. There's a lot of barriers, psychological barriers for people to get into learning. There's lots of good, rational reasons why employers don't invest and why individuals don't go back into learning. And the policy doesn't really understand that. There's really inappropriate regulation. Colleges, for instance, are subject to 3 types of regulation that are mainly designed for schools, for universities, and for for-profit providers. It doesn't really work for a college, and it's incredibly complex. The accountability measures are inappropriate and complex, and there's loads of bureaucracy that gets in the way. So it's a sector that delivers loads, but it's constrained. It's constrained by not enough funding, but also siloed funding. Lots of colleges are dealing with 25 to 30 funding lines, all with their own arcane rules, priorities, expectations that don't allow the college actually to deliver what people, places and employers want and need. Employers don't spend enough on training, and why would they when they've been fed government funding all the time and told that the government will meet their needs? So as a country, our employers just are a long way behind employers in other countries, and we need to change that. It's not just about government funding, it's also about making sure there's a culture in our country of employers investing in their workforce and thinking about how they get productivity from people as well as innovation and capital. There's lots of prejudice as well. I still, again, just wince on a daily basis about how people sort of look down on the further education system, a sneering about BTECs and applied generals. You think vocational technical quals are just a bit Mickey Mouse, and the media is like that too. It's changing, and I don't want to be completely negative, but it's still a long way to go to get to the point where we're a respected sector in our own right for what we do, what we deliver, the impact we have, the support we give to people and to employers. And then the environment has been about competition, and it's competition that really has led to the delivery of the cheapest. You know, we've done a lot of analysis over the last couple of years that we've shared with government that shows that this sort of pseudo market that colleges and other providers operate in has really led to lots and lots of delivery of things that are cheap and easy to deliver, but at the expense of stuff that's really important and stuff that is needed in the economy, in the labour market. You know, the expensive to deliver engineering, construction, advanced manufacturing, perhaps in terms of digital, because it's expensive to get staff with those skills. So we've got to move away from that. And finally, you know, we're constrained more than anything, I think, by a culture which says, you go to school, you do your GCSEs, you do well, you do your A-levels, you do well, you go to university and you're made for life. And that has been absolutely the kind of mindset for the last 20, 30 years, and it needs to change. And it is changing, but it's stopped us from understanding the need for lifelong learning, for people to go forward into the labour market for 50+ year careers, to be able to train and retrain for learning that is enriching, that's about community, that's about tolerance, that's about understanding the world we operate in. So there is a long, long way to go. So where are we? Well, today's Prime Minister's announcement was great, because last week we had the Chancellor come out with his winter economy plan, which unfortunately was all about jobs again. And we know that jobs are important, but we also know that there won't be enough jobs. The Chancellor said so last week. Overnight, the Prime Minister, sort of trailing his announcement or his speech today, said there won't be enough jobs, so we need to do more than that. It was great, because we said that last week when the Chancellor came out. The Labour Party said it, and people like Jürgen Meyer from Siemens said it. There was a kind of consensus that it's not just about jobs, because the recession is so enormous. What we need is a skills and training plan alongside the jobs plan and the job support and retention schemes. And it sounds like the Prime Minister listened and has come out with this announcement today. Now, it's an announcement that is kind of repackaging some of the things they've already announced. So some people are being a bit, you know, churlish and going, well, there's nothing new in there. Actually, for the Prime Minister to be announcing this, to be talking about further education, to be talking about college delivery, I think is significant. I think it's a really big step forward. And I think it augurs well, useful word, augurs well for the white paper and the spending review. And it's driven, I think, by these 5 big issues. So the first is, if you go back to the election in December 2010, there was a very clear commitment from the government to this levelling up agenda, which I've talked about. They still need to deliver on it. They're absolutely going to have to show that that's what they're doing. Their commitment is such a fundamental part of delivering the votes up in what used to be the red wall, now the blue wall. Second is that employers before pandemic were struggling to recruit skilled workers, particularly in that level 3, 4, 5 space. We think after Brexit and with the pandemic that the sectors might be slightly different, but in construction, NHS, in digital, cybersecurity, that Marie-Therese's college did some fantastic work on the Queen's Anniversary Prize, in logistics, there's a whole set of skills needs that will come back quite quickly in recovery, that need skills that we just don't have the infrastructure for. We don't have people ready to do that training at those levels. And we've been so reliant on skilled people coming from overseas, and that's going to slow down. Third is they need to rebalance the post-education, post-18 education system away from universities, not take money away, but rebalance the spending. Philip Auger's report and the panel proposed that. And all of the government's polling shows that that will be popular, that the people who voted them in, their traditional voters and their new voters, want to see more investment in technical education and apprenticeships. And that's what the Prime Minister is announcing today. It's a first step, and I'll come to that in a minute, but it's a really good first step. Fourth is the Dame Marie-Therese review, and I'd really recommend you have a look at it. It's a fairly short report, but really, really to the point, said we need a shift in relationship between government and colleges. And the government are taking that seriously. They want colleges to be strategic partners. They want a nurturing relationship, as described by Dame Marie-Therese. And finally, as I said before, there was so much, not opposition to what the Chancellor announced last week, but so much commentary saying it's just not enough. Why aren't you doing more on training? It's not just about jobs. And I think, today's speech shows that they've been listening, and it gives me a lot of hope ahead of the spending review and the white paper. So it's an important step forward, but there's loads more that's needed. I won't dwell on this. We submitted our comprehensive spending review submission last week. There were 5 sections of it. One, just lots of immediate issues. You know, colleges have had so much extra expenditure. The average college, we think, is spending at least £200,000, if not more. Big ones over £500,000, and we need support for them and for students. You know, the digital divide needs more laptops, it needs more dongles, it needs more support for young people. We need a further education strategy, and I'll come on to that in a minute, that the post-18 review talked about. We need 3 massive investment in adults, which today's announcement helps with, but is not quite sufficient. And we need big increase in spending on young people, which we've been talking about for a long time, which, you know, started to improve this year with a 7% rate uplift, but it's nowhere near enough. And then finally, we need to improve the efficiency of the system. It needs to be made more simple, and I'll come to that. So have a look at that. But I've got one slide that sets out some of the thinking on this, and I know Marie-Therese and Lewis and others later will talk more about this as we go through. 4 big areas I think the white paper needs to deliver on, that I think will really help set out a fantastic future for the further education sector. And I have to start, I suppose, by saying lots of this is about colleges, but it's not just about colleges. I'm talking about colleges because I think they are different to independent training providers. They're different to schools, they're different to universities, they're different to adult ed providers. Doesn't mean that they're the most important, but what we want from this white paper is to secure a special place for colleges to work together with all of those other providers. And I think it's a really important distinction. There's a place, an important place for all of those institutions, but I'm sort of here saying colleges have got a special place. They exist everywhere. They're part of the national infrastructure. They are public ethos institutions. You know, every community, every place needs a thriving college. It also needs adult ed providers, it needs ITPs, it needs great schools and universities as well. But here I'm advocating for colleges. So first is we need a strategy. We've got no national post-16 strategy. And what we want is for that post-16 strategy to be about industrial strategy, about inclusive growth, about the labour market, about lifelong learning, about all of the people who need and will need training and retraining through their lives. And that nationally we need to set that out. And then we need collaborative plans to be developed in every place in the country. And that collaboration has to be across all of the providers, but also in partnership and engagement with employers and employer organisations, with local authorities, with major employers, with community organisations and third sector organisations. And it needs to really understand those priorities in the local labour market, as well as the kind of cold spots, the communities and the people who haven't engaged in learning, who need literacy, numeracy, ESOL just to get on that first ladder. And it needs to go all the way through from those levels all the way through to at least level 5, and then giving people opportunity to go on to level 6. Secondly, we need much more focus on advising, particularly SMEs, but businesses generally, on how to improve their productivity, on how to improve their success, and how to innovate, and how to think about how skills can help them be more successful. Because more than anything, we've got a kind of inertia around productivity that leads to lack of investment in technology, in innovation, in people, in capital, and we need to turn that around. And the college business centre idea that we've been promoting, picked up by DFE, I think, is going to be really, really important in that. It will, we think, support more people to have the opportunity to do higher technical levels and subjects. It will be kind of behind the boost to level 3, 4, 5, because it's not just enough to give, you know, an entitlement or an opportunity to learn at level 3. It's also about stimulating demand. It's about making sure people understand why level 3, 4, 5 will work for them as an individual or as them as a business. Third is we need to make sure this white paper repositions the relationship between government and colleges. I want to see colleges seen as key strategic and trusted partners of government. I want them to be given much more authority in the places they occupy, to take a lead, to be systems leaders, to work in partnership with others. And really importantly, backed up by the flexibility to determine and set and deliver their own priorities. Because at the moment, those 25 to 30 funding lines all come with different priorities set in white. And there's no way Whitehall can know what's right in Stockton or in Plymouth or in Barrow. And actually, I don't want the town hall to replace Whitehall. I want the college to be the strategic leader. I want, in a sense, devolution to go to the college so that they can be the trusted leader of the skills response in partnership with schools, universities, adult ed and ITP. And then finally, if we're going to deliver all that, we need to strip away a lot of the complexity. We need a much simpler, much more sort of serendipitous, supporting, nurturing set of regulation, accountability and funding mechanisms. Because at the moment, quite frankly, colleges are just beset by negative, backward-looking micro bureaucracy, and that just won't help them. These are and need to be big major players alongside others in any place. They need to be able to be freed up to deliver what's needed, to be able to hit the priorities and to be measured on the outcomes that they deliver for those places, for those people and for productivity. And I think if we can do that, we're in for a fantastic few years. I'm pretty optimistic about it and I hope to hear from others over the next couple of hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I am told that you have had a surprise promotion to host of this event. So if you could take a minute and make Edge Foundation the host again, that would be excellent. Yeah. Apparently you have instructions on how to do that. I wouldn't be able to tell you where to start. But thank you again for that. And we now move on to Marie-Therese McGovern, former principal of Belfast Met and non-executive director of the Strategic Investment Board for Northern Ireland, to share her thoughts. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia, and thank you very much for having me. And thank you, David, for setting the scene so eloquently and so passionately as always. I, after 10 years in FE, retired this March. And in my journey over those 10 years, I became a very passionate advocate for the power and the possibility of further education and for its transformative ability for individuals and for society. And I'm desperate to make sure that other people share that. But I want to start by going back to January of this year. It seems a very long time ago, and there was a lot of hope in the air. We had a new decade. We hoped a new approach, a new government, with a huge majority. And while we may have discussions about that, the fact that it had a huge majority meant that if we could convince it of certain things, we probably could do much more than before. So the air was full of opportunity. It was a good place, as David said, and I share his view that this is a crux place. I had been a founder member of the Four Nations College Leaders Alliance, which is a very active UK-wide network now of leaders in FE. And I was also then invited to be part of the Independent Commission for the Future, and I was delighted to be so. And the reason that the commission was set up was because we believed that there was the possibility of galvanizing public narrative and to be catalytic in raising new possibilities for FE. And we understood implicitly that our FE landscape was complex and difficult to understand, and that public knowledge was poor and often confused about what it was we did and what our offer was. So the Commission wanted to make this reality, or take this reality and bend it towards a new arc. And what we asked was, what do we want and need for colleges to be in 10 years' time? And we decided 10 years was a good time frame to have this conversation in. And what changes would we need to bring about to bend that arc? And fundamental to our thinking from the very, very beginning was that we believed that FE did have a critical role to play around the concepts of people, productivity and place, that FE required a deepening of collaboration and networking, and I'll come back to that, and that it also needed a focus on new workforce development processes, structures and plans. The role of and function of that new FE was set against what in last January were the significant big challenges that we saw that we believed FE could take on. Obviously, the big one was Brexit and its implications and what that would mean, and the fact that Britain had become a divided Britain around that concept. Secondly was the whole issue in the UK of social inclusion, of social inequity, of the poverty divide, of the need to increase mobility. Thirdly was the impact of technology and it's, the looming issues that were going to come with Industry 4.0, but also the fact that Britain had deep problems in relation to its productivity levels. And then lastly was the big issue of sustainability, of climate change and its impact for green economies and whatever. So our thinking at that time was around the requirement for a new national skills strategy for the UK, which could then, in a sense, be have its own versions in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England, but that there was a unifying concept which would take us over the next 10 years into the FE sector that we wanted to be. And what we wanted to see in it was an education and skills system that was cohesive and connected to economic, industrial and other national strategies, not isolated in the corner, and which gave FE a very clear and confident role in the future of the UK. So that was where we were in January, and then COVID came. So I'm not going to dwell and I'm not going to go into what COVID has done to us. If anything, I just believe it has underlined the huge need we now need for an excellent FE system. The huge and growing issues that we're going to have with redundancy and with unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, but not exclusively youth unemployment, the long-term consequences of a missing school year. And, I know from my own experience in working in FE, the fundamental role of FE tends to be the bucket that catches all the problems that emerge. And I believe that this missed year of schooling will, in the next 2 to 3 years, start to absolutely concretize into major problems for the UK in the future. The health issues, we know that health and educational attainment are intimately linked. And I think that the implications of what COVID does to the health profile of the UK will also come back to our door in time to go. And then the big question is, how can technology be harnessed for the future? We've seen some of that possibility through COVID. We're experiencing it this morning, but we also need to delve much deeper. So where does that take us in terms of what FE should be doing for the future? So I think that COVID has absolutely underlined the need for change and transformation, which existed before it, but is now even more real and required. And the key issues that we need to look at, and David has mentioned some of them, is that we are dealing at the minute with an FE sector that has many difficulties around it. And funding, I think, is the least of it. I think we've already hinted that there is a lack of clarity about what it is, what we do. There is a lack of consistency, and we need to face that across the FE sector. I think there are tolerance of levels of poor quality in parts of FE that we just need to face and talk about and deal with. We need to get rid of the notion that one size fits all, because one size doesn't fit all. And we also need to note that as time has moved on, we are seeing a drift between the 4 nations of the UK in terms of their vocational processes and their structures. And I think that that's difficult for the long term. The current crisis with C-19 has underlined all of those challenges and has told us those challenges themselves have not gone away. And we now need to face those and move forward. And I think the first step is that we need to attack what I call the skills illiteracy, which exists in the UK. And there continues, though that is beginning to change, and the PM's announcement today is a good step forward. But there is a notion still that skills really don't have a fundamental or a foundational part to play in economic success. And I think that we need to understand economics better in the UK and understand the role of skills in that. And I think we also need, as a sector, to get over our own identity crisis, and FE needs to stand up and take its place. David talked about bigger, better and bolder. Well, I think it's time for FE to decide what its brand is and no more prevaricating around it. It needs to lean in to ambition, as Sheryl Sandberg told all us women some time ago. We need to own our own ambition. And to do that, I think we need to do three things. Firstly, we need to conceive of what FE is. So what is our space? What is our unique selling proposition? Is it in that level 3, 4, and 5? Is it in being the institution that is more likely to link you to work than any other institution? You know, is it that technical and professional space that Sir Frank McLaughlin talks always eloquently and passionately about? We need to conceive what that is and then own it. We need to believe in it. We need to say, this is what we are and this is what we mean and this is the role and function we have. And having done that, then we need to achieve. We need to change and transform. So the Cinderella service, as we're often known, I think needs to chuck the waiting for the prince stuff. I think what we need to say is, you know what, we're actually going to develop a global company selling high-end shoes, and we're going to match the Jimmy Choos and the Manolas. That's our space. And to do so, I think we need to agree that this won't be an easy process, that there are big decisions and choices that will have to be made. But it's about deciding what we maintain in terms of our current amazing role, what we grow in new products, new directions, and what we lose and stop doing. And I think that means for us to own the room. To do that, I think we need to ensure that we just don't get into the room. And I think a lot of the processes that I've experienced in FE is about getting into the room. I think we've got to stop being grateful for being in the room. We need to be in the room and to own the room, to say this room is our rightful place to be. And I think that's going to take quite a bit of work. David talked about, and I've reiterated, the people, productivity and place concept that we've talked about in the commission. And I think people are a defining heart of what we do. And, you know, in terms of the students we work with, but also in terms of our employees, we need to think differently and outside the box. In terms of the people we work with, the students we bring across our door, I think we need a new and much stronger dynamic contract with them and a framework for lifelong learning. We need to be aligned very strongly to the economic needs of our locality so that we're serving our students well. We need to base the hope of transformation and widening participation and extending reach into communities, because we, I believe, with our dual mandate, are one of the few institutions that can reach into parts of the community that other parts of the other institutions simply can't. We need to seek stronger personalized approaches, and obviously COVID has given us the technological push and nudge to begin to look at more personalized approaches to individual students and ones that cope with the diversity of the student bodies that we have. And I think what we need to say to each person who comes over our threshold is that we are elite institutions. We absolutely are elite institutions, but we are elite institutions with open doors. In other words, we say, come in and enjoy the quality. To do this, on the other side, we need to transform fundamentally our approach to workforce development. I think we will need to invest in real systems and processes that enhance our employees' abilities to teach more effectively. That means grappling with technology, being more flexible, dealing with this personalized work with students. We need to find ways to create early and easy movement between our employees and what we used to call the cold face. We need to be able to have a system that allows movement back and forth very easily. We need to, in my view, invent new career pathways, and we need to create new roles in college. So we need to start thinking about, do we need data analysts in our colleges? Do we need researchers in our colleges? Do we need IT pioneers in our colleges? And all of that will lead to new contracts, which in FE will be difficult and will cause issues. On the other side of that, we also need better leadership. We need to look for new skills in that leadership cadre. We need greater diversity in that, and we need whole systems approach management, which is different from the individual college focus that we have now. If we turn to productivity, then productivity is at the heart of economic and social development. and it has been the bane of UK economic life for very many years, as we know. I believe, and the Commission believes, that FE has a fundamental role to play in changing that. Firstly, I think that means that we need to develop a much stronger and deeper way in linking with business and industry. It will require very, very strong employer engagement strategies from colleges so that we can build on a new reputation for relevance and for adaptability. Now, in some parts of the UK and Northern Ireland, for example, colleges are mandated to work, to do quite a significant proportion of their work directly with business, and not just in providing training, but in doing things like prototyping, innovation vouchers, looking at how they develop their websites, looking at any issue with them that enhances their ability to be a good business. And I think that we as colleges will need, the new college will need to seek to situate itself at the centre of new ecosystems for economic development and growth. The new college will also have to embrace innovation itself and in the way it works. And we need to be ahead of the curve, looking at where industry is going and how we best can serve that. I attended the FE leadership programme at Said and had the great privilege of hearing Michael Osborne, who's like a world expert on AI and Industry 4.0. And he gave us this really interesting statistic when we worry about, you know, automation is going to end things. What he said was in 1900, 97% of workers in the United States of America worked in agriculture. Today, 3% do. That's a real thought for us all. And we need to be on the cutting arc of what are those new jobs in the green economy, in energy, in the digital economy, that we can begin to work to develop the skill sets and the skills work around that. Such work requires greater focus on specialisation. David's already talked about specialist colleges. Again, in Northern Ireland, we have moved to a hub process where each college has its own specialty. In my own case, our specialty was ICT. And that is a process by which our college services other colleges in terms of curriculum development and in terms of CDP. The third P is placemaking, and the role of place, in my view, cannot be underestimated. Place matters, and place building and making have now become, I think, a really important part of the future success of the UK, but also any future college that wants to be successful needs to be there. The concept of an anchor institution, an institution which is at the heart of communities and at the heart of collaboration in a geographical economic area, I think its time has come. To have impact and relevance, I believe colleges of the future need to be at the heart of significant stakeholder networks. Back to owning the room. They need to be connected, networked, and integrated into their local geographical locality. Colleges forget that the sheer power and size of the college in terms of the number of people it employs and what it does and should give it leverage in terms of those conversations. But too often colleges underplay that role and do not insist on their place. At this stage, I believe colleges need to be vying to be at the heart of all the recovery processes, and no recovery processes that are being developed anywhere in the UK should have the absence of their local FE colleges. They need to be right in there, right in the middle. Now, doing all of this, these massive transformations, also requires resourcing, because I'm not Pollyanna. I know that all of this comes at a cost. David's already talked again eloquently, and I'm not going to go into that, but we do need sustainable long-term planning and funding for the sector. We need minimum 3-year planning cycles, no more year on year trying to guess what your budget's going to look like for the coming year. We need to acknowledge that we've been underfunded for years, and it's interesting, in Northern Ireland we are embarked now on a new process to develop a new Northern Ireland skills strategy. And what is interesting is they've actually done a lot of research, and they're now fessing up that FE in Northern Ireland has actually, in the last 10 years, its funding has shrunk by 1/3. Meanwhile, the school and the university sector's funding has absolutely grown. And that needs to be rebalanced and rethought. The new funding, of course, comes with the other side. There are always strings attached. And I think that what we're talking about for the future is a new accountability regime, a new strategic outcomes focus, not bums on seats, which is traditionally how we've been funded. And that requires changes for us to be able to stand up and say, these are the outcomes we deliver and this is how we deliver it. But it also requires a new understanding by funders of long-term vision, of outcome-based accountability. And we know that the Scottish model has particularly pushed that. We need strategic dialogue between colleges and funders. And this will be a massive cultural change for the future. It also impacts, as David also outlined, on the scrutiny regimes that we are currently in, the regulation regimes. We need a process of earned autonomy, that we are grown up, that we can deliver, and we don't need to be looked at every 5 minutes to ensure that what we're doing is right. This then speaks to governance. And I think that changing all of those regimes then says that we now need to move to a different kind of governance framework. And I'll only, again, talk about two issues that strike me in terms of this. The first is this concept of outcomes-based accountability. And it does lead to lots of questions about size, number, structure, how many of us there are. And I think that it has opened, certainly in the Commission, has opened a whole discussion about potential rationalisation of the number of colleges that we have currently in the UK. The 3 devolved nations have already gone down this path. Each of them have hugely rationalised. In Northern Ireland, we went from 16 colleges down to 6. In Scotland, the number was halved, and I think also in Wales. This is a difficult issue. It's one that raises a lot of issues, but we believe, certainly in Northern Ireland, we believe that the rationalisation strengthened FE, did not diminish it. And this is a thorny issue that needs to be looked at. On the other side of the coin is the quality and the function of governors in FE. And I think that we need to relook at the skills we need in governors. We need to be able to assess their capacity and their capability to actually manage systems, outcomes, rather than individual institutions. So the days of saying the only thing you want to do is get an Ofsted grade 1 is not any longer, in my view, a sufficient measure of whether a college is good, bad, or indifferent. And the other issue, I think, in relation to, and it's one for all colleges, is the issue of diversity and recruitment for this brave new world. So the new college doing all of this needs to work very, very hard on the issue of its reputation. In that terms, I think that colleges also will become repositories of data analytics, of research, of policy engagement and developing, because that's what they have to do. They've got to amass the evidential base which says we are good at what we do, we can make a change and we have the evidence to prove it. I think also we need to look at the role and function of some kind of national college for FE leadership and FE development. The Side Business School, which the Education and Training Foundation has been developing, is a fantastic first step, but it is English based, and we need to look at how we create a framework for national leadership and national standards in FE. And that's something I think that we need to look at for the future. I think we also need to very comprehensively decide how we find champions in the system for what we do. So in conclusion, I think that the UK desperately needs a new, reinvigorated FE sector. It needed it before COVID-19, and if anything, it's now become an existential issue, I think, for the future of this country post COVID-19. The OECD did a massive report recently for Northern Ireland on what successful regions' skills systems look like. And they concluded that there are 4 elements. One is that the society creates a culture of lifelong learning. Secondly, that it seeks and works relentlessly to reduce skills imbalances. Thirdly, it effectively uses skills in the workforce and in the workplace, engaging employers to continually reskill and upskill their own workforces. And lastly, that all of the countries that are successful demonstrate a very strong governance of the skills policy process. So there's very joined up governance in terms of policy development. And in all of those successful countries, it is underlined with a vibrant, respected, dynamic, and very, very hardworking vocational education sector. I commend the Edge Foundation's excellent report, and it did, for me, underline again the work that is needed. We have underlined the key role for FE in the country's future, the need for it to be at the front line of social and economic recovery, and the need for the attention and the backing of government. And I commend Edge, and I hope that they will continue to be the proactive force that they've been. I think we're at a crossroads. The drift, to go back to the drift of the Four Nations and their work in the college, I think can be seen in two ways. It can be seen negatively as an end to a coherence and a fracturing of vocational education across the UK, or it can be seen positively as an opportunity to define a coherent heart and core for what colleges do, while allowing flexibility and experimentation, which can be shared and where we can learn together for the future. I prefer the positive interpretation. The new white paper, I think, can grasp these opportunities. We need to get with the new national zeitgeist, which says we can do things differently. C19 can assist us, I think, to transform for the better, despite what it is. I believe that FE is up to this, that it can take this challenge on and be a resilient, impacting, and fantastic transformative force in the future of the UK. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marie-Therese. Certainly plenty in there for us to ask you about later. We now have just a few minutes for each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their work. Sadly, Janet McCausland from Skills Development Scotland isn't able to be with us today, so there'll not be a Scottish perspective on the panel as such, but I know that both Lewis and Olly will be able to share some insight into how things work in Scotland. So let's start with you, Rachel. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
Happy to. I'm Dr. Rachel Bowen. I'm Director of Policy and Public Affairs at Colegau Cymru Colleges Wales. And if we'd had this event back in the spring as originally planned, well, things would have obviously looked very different. And the piece that I wrote for the Edge report on a plan for further education was actually about the proposed restructure of the post-16 education sector across Wales. And that would have been a biggest shake-up for a generation. But coronavirus had other ideas. And so the current Welsh Government has recognised that this legislation is just simply too complex to complete the process this parliamentary term. And while they'd like to carry on with it, there's the small matter of the Welsh general election in May 2021. And we know that there's no guarantee that a future Welsh Government, even if it's the same political party, is going to want to pick up this legislation, because it's not just from a previous parliamentary term, but it was designed and drafted in a pre-coronavirus world. And as Colleges Wales looks towards this election in May 2021, the issues of how colleges can implement change post-COVID, how we can help to create an economic recovery that isn't just a return to what we had before, or tinkering around the edges, but one that truly works for all our citizens. These are the issues that are occupying us now. And we're producing our own series of ideas for what the next Welsh Government should do to support further education in Wales. And the introduction to the Edge report and what we've heard from the speakers today talks about the need for the further education sector to develop a clear and positive identity, a plan of its own. And this is something that we in Wales would definitely agree with. Lots of the ideas that we're going to be picking up for a future Welsh Government complement the ideas that we've heard about from the Commission on the College of the Future. So in terms of some specifics, we want to see a Wales where there's a citizen's entitlement to everyone's first level 3 qualification being funded. And if we have to prioritise in the first instance, we'd look at making this free for people up to the age of 25, but with a view to expanding it as soon as possible. And as learning becomes more blended, as every course has a greater online element, We want to see a digital entitlement where all further education learners can access devices and adequate broadband. But it isn't just about kit and internet access. We know that effective online learning also needs a safe space where people can learn. And as some of us have found over the past 6 months, crowded homes, small bedrooms, sometimes other adults or siblings learning or working from home, these don't necessarily equate to spaces where people can really benefit from online learning. So we need to think about how we can address that, how FE can provide those sorts of spaces. We've also got things to say about the workforce of the future, better skills and business engagement, physical and mental health, how colleges can be a big part of supporting that. But there's not really time for me to go into that now today. But of course, a lot of this, as we touched on, needs funding. And that's a big issue given the financial challenges facing Wales and the UK more broadly. And while the origins of the saying are disputed, I'm a great believer in the saying that if you think education's expensive, try ignorance, because investing in supporting FE isn't a choice, it's an essential. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Next, we have Lewis Cooper from the Independent Commission on the College of the Future.
Thanks very much, Julia. So I was going to pick up just on some points that David and Marie-Therese have particularly spoken about in terms of the vision that we set out with the Independent Commission on the College of the Future for the role that colleges can play for people, productivity and place. And I suppose particularly drawing on the point that Marie-Therese was making towards the end, that we found the Four Nations approach that we've taken through the Independent Commission, and obviously that this event also reflects, to be a phenomenal strength of the approach and really drawing on the very best of the policy trajectories, partnerships and institutional practices has been a real something that we found tremendously valuable. So I thought I'd just talk through people, productivity and place, and just to show that these are really not kind of pie in the sky ideas, but they are things that are really happening in institutions within the Four Nations currently that we need to really draw on, scale up and ensure they're much more consistent across the place. So David and Marie-Therese have described the role that colleges can play for people as a much more active touch point for people right throughout their lives. It's a genuine lifetime education service, but also a kind of resource that we're tapping into to support independent learning, to support business development and so on. Obviously, the Prime Minister's speech today is a really important kind of acknowledgement of that trajectory, and Rachel's spoken about that as a key priority in Wales too. And so that provides a kind of massive jumping off point for us to develop. But clearly the financial support element of this is also going to be critical. And obviously we have a huge wealth of recent policy reviews across the Four Nations that we can draw from there as well. Obviously the Diamond Review that I would be a fan of, wouldn't I, in Wales makes a massive case for a much more expanded student support offer in further education. And Jane Ann Gardier's work in Scotland similarly makes the case. And there you're talking about figures from £8,000 to £9,000 financial support a year. So we really need to be looking at this alongside affordability of funding as well. And we also there look to the Hazelcorn review, which talks about the case for a much more interconnected education and skills system, which allows for a much more lifetime service. And obviously the work of the Scottish Funding Council at the moment on their tertiary review too. So people is a practice that we're seeing kind of articulated really strongly across a range of reviews, which we feel we can really usefully draw on. The role for colleges in providing a much more expanded role for strategic business support feels absolutely critical. And again, we look particularly there to Northern Ireland, and Marie-Therese has spoken about that. But the work that Belfast Met in particular has undertaken on cybersecurity and the Queen's Award that they've received in acknowledgement of that is really exemplary, and it's exactly the kind of thing that we need to support colleges across the Four Nations to be developing. I think that's about meeting a kind of really first order challenge as we support business support, as we move to a net zero carbon economy, and as we look at our COVID recovery. But also it speaks to Rachel's point as well about how do we offer opportunities for workforce development, and that really close strategic relationship between colleges, employers, across strategic support and close to market innovation really feels a critical way of unlocking that. And I've referenced Belfast Met as an example, but there are so many other examples. Internationally, we looked at Canada and the Basque Country, but within the Four Nations, we can look to Coleg Cambria, we can look to Dudley, we can look to Bridgewater and Taunton, City of Glasgow. There are really huge examples that we can draw from scale up and better support. And in place, so we feel that colleges have a key role to play in fostering healthy, connected communities. And so you might describe that in terms of levelling up or social inclusion or future generations or whatever it might be. And there are exemplary practices here as well. So I looked to Weston College, who have a strategy to support the mental health and well-being of Weston as a community outside the college, and what's their role working with the NHS and others to address that. Dumfries and Galloway College and the role that they play in sustainability and really working with other colleges, but also other civic and public institutions to support the transition to a net zero carbon economy. And also looking to amazing stuff that colleges across the four nations have done in terms of tackling digital exclusion since COVID. And you looked at incredible institutional practices, and I've heard reams of them within each of the four nations. So it precisely shows colleges taking a responsibility towards their wider community, towards business support, producing PPE and so on. So there are incredible institutional practices there that precisely describe that placemaking anchor institution role. David and Marie-Therese have talked about what we need to do in terms of taking that forward, and I think that's really critical, and I think it is an affirmation of the vision that we're describing, and I think there's a real kind of growing consensus about this remit, which we describe across people, productivity and place, that this needs to be reflected in nation-specific strategies that need to be aligned to industrial strategy and a social inclusion strategy. Northern Ireland again is exemplary in terms of I suppose where it sits and the links with the Department for the Economy. You need those longer term funding settlements and clearer accountabilities, and that more partnership based approach. And there we look to the Scottish Funding Council as an organisation that takes a much more supportive role of their role in investing in the long term health of colleges as part of the national infrastructure, and that really feels critical. Yeah, fundamentally, I think our very strong view is that the future is here, but just really unevenly distributed. And what we need to do is make sure that we can build up the very best practices and policies across the four nations. And then we've got something incredibly strong. And it does feel across the four nations, the time really is now for being really quite bold.
Thanks very much, Lewis. And finally, Olly, could you just introduce yourself in just a couple of minutes?
Yes, of course. I'll be quick. Really nice to have everyone here. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a few things about Edge's work in this space. And we've been long-term supporters of further education and proper funding, which has come up a few things. So firstly, I think we're really keen to continue our research work in this space. We published a report with UCL about the Four Nations, and I'll put the link in the chat after I finish speaking, which led to the Four Nations Alliance that Marie-Therese mentioned. And we're kind of keen to grab lessons from where we can. So we've been supporters of the Foundation Apprenticeships in Scotland, for instance, and the way that colleges collaborate in Northern Ireland as models for the ways that we should do that across the UK. I think we need to focus down on what colleges do. As we've said a few times, I had an experience just before COVID in the before times when you actually got to visit places, sitting in a college waiting room, and I saw their different prospectuses laid out. And I think there were 4 or 5 different ones for the different services they did. And I thought, wow, that's very different from a corporate headquarters where you might have kind of one single version of the truth. That's a really tough kind of sell in terms of those different areas. And of course, we want to support FE to lead the way in engaging, teaching, and with really strong business engagement as well. We've done that through funding projects like the amazing work that Derby College has been doing with Twycross Zoo, with Yeovil, and the work they've been doing on healthcare simulation. But we're also keen to engage things like project-based learning and through our teacher externship work, which gets teachers and tutors out into local businesses. So yeah, really lovely to see everyone here and really keen to continue to support the sector to grow and thrive.
Thank you very much, and that really was quick. Thank you very much to the panel for that. And so audience, it's now your time to get involved. Post your questions in the Q&A box below, and I'll do my very best to take them to the panelists. Now, the white paper has been quite a big focus of everyone's work recently, although it's not entirely clear when we may see it. So let's start with a question on that. David, you already set out in your presentation in quite broad terms what you would like to see. So Lewis, why don't you tell us a little bit from the Commission's perspective on what you think the big issues are that it needs to address?
Well, I think fundamentally it's about that point on how do you scale up the very best institutional practices within England, and I think drawing on the best practices across the four nations too. And I think there are a bunch of things that DFE could crack on with and we'd really like to see within the white paper. One is you need an acknowledgement of a system, and it seems an obvious point, but I think fundamentally a sense that we have an education and skills system which needs to be much more interconnected, much more joined up. And that has to be framed by a national strategy. So I think there's a need for that to be a fundamental piece, something like a 10-year strategy that enables the longer term funding settlements that Marie-Therese was talking about is really critical. So that feels like a first element. Secondly, how you support colleges to come together within networks across an appropriate economic geography. And I think colleges are fundamentally context specific. And whilst they have this overarching role across people productivity in place, what that looks like will look particular within a particular space. So I think there's a really, and Marie-Therese said this is a challenging question, but how do you empower colleges as strategic partners to work together with others across an appropriate economic geography is incredibly important, and something I think really has to be grappled with, and I think is being grappled with through the FE white paper. We need the longer term funding settlement. So I think a shift to 3-year funding settlements based on high level outcome agreements is really, really critical. These funding flexibilities need to empower colleges to make the right decisions for them and their communities across people productivity in place. And I think that could be really expanded through this developed employer support function. And I think we've been talking about employer hubs, DFE are talking about college business centres. I think that really has to happen. The key point there is how do you make sure that these are part of a systemic shift rather than becoming individuated kind of activities that don't kind of connect. And the worst thing possible would be that these end up as a badge that attracts a little bit of capital funding, but doesn't really spill over into the wider system. I think the key question for college business centres is, why do I benefit from having one near to me? As a college, how does that really spill over? And I think there's huge lessons from Northern Ireland and the curriculum hubs model that can be drawn on there. And then I think today really brings out massive opportunities for a reaffirmation of the importance of lifelong learning. And I think that's something that the FE white paper in an English context will really be taken forward. I think it's critical across the four nations, and obviously it's a key priority, I think, for politicians across the four nations. So we really need to be grappling with not just the fees element, but the financial support element. And I think that's a really kind of obvious point that we need to pick up on from the Prime Minister's speech that he'll be giving later today. So that's a few kind of priorities, I think, for us for the FE white paper.
Anything, Olly, that you think Edge would have to add on the white paper?
Yeah, just to add a couple of things to what Lewis was saying, really, because I think this theme is so important. The first is, believe it or not, I worked in the department when we were doing 14 to 19 diplomas. Who remembers that? I would get people to raise their hands, but obviously we can't do that quite on Zoom. But one of the things that I thought was really important behind that was saying that this collaboration is so important that the government at that point were going to fund it. And I think it's important to remember that there is a cost to that collaboration, and to do it really, really well, it has to be somebody's full-time job to hold those relationships and to do it really in a really strong way, rather than it being a teacher or a tutor's kind of Wednesday afternoon job. So I would definitely add that. I think we really want to encourage, and this is something that we're passionate about at Edge, the chance for tutors to go back and spend more time in their industries, because as Marie-Therese was saying, we need to really support that USP of the further education sector. And one of the really strong ones of those is we're really close to employment. We know we've got these real life examples. We've got tutors who are experienced. So we would love to see more kind of organized externships and opportunities for tutors to go back, spend time in industry, and then bring that really cool latest experience back into their classrooms and their organizations through projects that link back to employment.
So coronavirus has obviously very much changed what is happening at FE at this point. Across the devolved nations, what are some of the lessons learned for the FE sector from the lockdowns? Rachel, would you mind starting off with some of the experience in Wales?
Yes, I think that it's shown the importance of colleges being versatile and prepared. So we were fortunate that lots of colleges were already delivering in innovative ways, making use of online learning. And so that meant that when face-to-face teaching needed to end in the middle of March, colleges here were able to kind of pick up and carry on with things online. I think Lewis has touched on the fact already about the way colleges were able to respond to disadvantaged learners. I know that hundreds and hundreds of laptops were delivered across not just Wales, but across all, all 4 UK nations to those learners who needed them. I think in terms of what we've learnt over the past 6 months, that need to be able to respond quickly, which has always been a feature of colleges, is something that's really, really important. So as we've seen local lockdowns here, not just counties, but towns within counties that need to be able to plan ahead and respond to what learners might need, how to manage kind of staff needs. Those are things that we're going to need to be able to do increasingly in the future. But I think one of the challenges is for government to be able to keep up with that. Colleges can do, but they need the support, the funding and the flexibility to be able to get on and do that. So it's about not just colleges being flexible, but government at all levels, whether that's local government, Welsh government, UK government, being quick to give people what they need.
Marie-Therese, how about Northern Ireland? What's the experience been there?
Well, I mean, echoing where Rachel's come from, there was a huge drive in the early days to just actually deal with the digital divide, because what became really, really clear, certainly in my own college, was that a third of our students simply could not access IT in any way. Either they didn't have the equipment or they didn't have the broadband. So that was, incredible amounts of work that was done on that. I think because of the closeness of the colleges in Northern Ireland to government via the department, the colleges also were very, very much involved in the development of the recovery programme. So, things like putting in applications for quick turnaround. So one of the issues in Northern Ireland we discovered was not the digital deficit, which was there, but actually digital illiteracy, that a whole range of small firms just simply could not transfer their business to a kind of digital model. So we're getting small grant aid to work more intensively with that small business sector to actually increase significantly their ability to work in that digital sphere, because that's going to go on for some time to come. And then on the other hand, looking to work with, in the first instance, and it will get broader, but at this minute, a graduate futures program where graduates who have come out with all sorts of degrees, but again, no digital capacity, just don't understand the basics of that, will do short kind of 12-week courses, which will give them access to coding, to data analytics, to potentially the first rungs of cybersecurity. And that program is being launched with 120 students fairly soon. So the colleges have been very, very active, both individually working with their students, but also insisting that they're in those conversations around what the recovery is going to look like and what role and function they might play. And I will underline, and I think COVID is a great opportunity, and it's a desperate thing to say, but it is a great opportunity for colleges, because it allows them to demonstrate very strongly that their reaction to COVID, if you look at it, has been far better than either the school sector or the university sector. And I think I can say that. I think that our response and our ability to get out there has been faster, quicker, and more adaptable than those two other parts of the education sector.
David, I can see you nodding quite enthusiastically there. Anything you would like to add from an English perspective?
I think it's a very similar picture in England. I suppose I'd just build on what Marie-Therese was just saying, though. I think the college sector has come out of this with its reputation enhanced, actually. And I think that's because of the very, very strong focus on student need and getting it right for students. And I think that's been really powerful. But it's also been really constrained, So what colleges can't do is use any of its adult budget to meet the short-term needs of people being made redundant or unemployed, because it's not eligible for funding. And because those people can't afford not to claim universal credit if they've been made redundant. And the benefit system means they have to actively be seeking work, And it's those sorts of constraints that I think the white paper needs to really address, that we need much, much more freedom for colleges to act strategically, act quickly, have flexibility, and flexibility in setting those priorities, And we're going through massive structural change in the labour market. And yet there's been no response from government at all to that yet, So how many people have been and will be made redundant from hospitality, leisure and retail? It will be probably hundreds of thousands, if not into the millions. How many of those people will get back into those sectors? Not many. How many need to get retraining into social care, health, and other sectors? Probably most of them. How much facility has a college got to be able to do that? Almost zero. So it's really getting down to the brass tacks of those issues that we need to get to. And we shouldn't have to wait for Whitehall to get its act together between DWP, BAYS, DFE, and across the four nations. We should just be saying to colleges, if you've got the resources in your adult budget, use it for adult priorities, and not have to ask permission. And that would be the kind of leap of faith that I'd be looking for in the white paper and in the other reforms that are going on in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, which are actually very similar. They're not quite the same. The context is different, the politics are different, but they are very, very similar in terms of wanting colleges to be able to fulfill that role. But government needs to trust and needs to give up control in order for colleges to have more. And then can I just say something about collaboration? Because I think we end up often skating over this. We need a system in which all institutions are more confident about their own place in the system. And that will then enable collaboration. This is not about colleges sort of taking over and kind of getting in the way of someone else. It's just saying, what's the college role? Let's be really clear about it. And someone's asked a question about the EDSK report talking about 3 distinct missions, which I quite like. I think it helps, the 16 to 18 mission, the community mission, the kind of technical, higher technical mission. If we could be really clear about those missions, then we can say, well, how does that fit with the school mission? How does it fit with the university mission? How does it fit with the adult ed mission? How does it fit with ITPs, which are still have a really important role? But then everybody could know who's doing what. Everyone can respect each other, and there is enough in the system to help everyone be successful and get enough of the pie. But because we've had a competitive environment with not enough funding, everyone's kind of kicking each other, stabbing each other in the back to kind of recruit learners, and it's not in the interests of communities, people or places.
Julio, could I possibly just come in with an extra point there? That's a really, really well made point. And I think just to reflect on this point about collaboration with independent training providers as well, we had a great roundtable last week on the tech sector and tech education, where obviously there's some fantastic training providers who've got a really clear, focused mission, and they're delivering very quick training, which is exactly what businesses need. So it feels like that getting that kind of collaboration between training providers and colleges to learn the best from both is really important. And in particular, I think one of the questions has picked this up, but colleges have grown into massive businesses in their own right. So trying to make sure that college leaders and senior leadership teams and governance teams have the access to kind of business mentoring and things to be able to really take on and shine in that role.
Yeah, one of the questions we've got is relating to independent training providers, which David has already brought up and Olly's just picked up. So how do FE colleges create an ecosystem where independent providers can help FE innovate and flex to the needs of the modern economy and learners who need to be reskilled quickly? Marie-Therese, maybe that's something you would like to come in on?
Well, I mean, I have to say in terms of our own college, we were very happy to work with anybody who could enhance our work. So we did lots of innovative work on the spaces. We are the hub for ICT in Northern Ireland. We host all the employers in ICT. They have a forum where they meet regularly. So we're listening all the time to what they want. There are private providers who are part of that forum. And the college decided to be very flexible in working. It didn't turn anybody away. If we could increase and enhance the number of people with skills in ICT, then we would work with them. And I think sometimes there's a bit of a block that, let me go back to basics. It's kind of like what Olly said. People have got to get something out of it. They've got to be confident that they're entering a partnership where both will benefit. And I think there's been history of sometimes, the private trainer goes off and, is looking for their profit margin or whatever it happens to be. And colleges maybe aren't in that space and feel that they've been, manipulated. I think if you have open, honest conversations with your partner at the beginning, then you can find a way through that is mutually beneficial and is definitely beneficial to the student.
Rachel, I wondered what the Welsh perspective has been on collaboration, both with government and business, and also independent training providers.
With independent training providers, we're a small country, so we meet regularly, kind of in terms of things like apprenticeships. There's a pretty good relationship between colleges and private training providers in Wales. Obviously, there are certain issues that come up. We also do work closely with Welsh Government, in fairness. We've been involved in discussions around plans for coming out of lockdown, how we support the economy post-COVID. We've had regular meetings with the Education Minister, but also with the Minister for Economy and Transport. There's been a lot of engagement. I think sometimes it's just difficult for everybody to move at a pace that needs to be moved at, and for people to respond quite as quickly as you want them to. We're a small country. I think that helps in terms of knowing the right people to go to, and we've got pretty good access to people for discussions here.
And as our final question, as I know we're all keen to make sure that we're ready for Boris Johnson's speech, which I'm now told is slightly earlier than we all thought. The employee engagement, Maddie is asking, is a key element to supporting FE students' progression to their chosen qualifications and pathways. She's interested to hear from the panel as to how employers can be incentivized to support students when they themselves are struggling with the impact of COVID. Lewis, maybe that's something you could speak on from a Commission's perspective?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose here we do draw from, again, from the experience, particularly, I think, of Northern Ireland. So I think it's how do we ensure that what colleges are offering genuinely complements what's available in the wider ecosystem. And I think what Belfast Met and other colleges in Northern Ireland particularly have done is playing that really core convening role. So where do you go to get support on cybersecurity or ICT? Well, you go to the college, and the college can then help you to bring in all the other sorts of experts. So all of that lives and dies on, is the college giving you quality advice that's the right thing? Do SMEs tell others that this was really good, it really worked for me? And all of that returns to the ITP point. So if colleges are cannibalizing at that point, people won't turn to them. If they're genuinely bringing in the very best that are able to help the business in terms of that need, then it's inevitably something that will really take off. So that feels critical. I mean, all of the thought around what we're calling employer hubs absolutely turns to colleges being the authority and the freedoms to really take on a leadership role here, but then working within a really closely joined up education and skills ecosystem to bring other partners into the picture. And so that really feels critical. I suppose turning just briefly to David's point as well, our starting point is colleges, but colleges will have to come together with other partners to look at what are the priorities in this space and what already exists. I always say if colleges in Sheffield say that there's needed to develop something on advanced manufacturing, everyone will say, no, you've got the AMRC at Sheffield University. So it really is what complements the existing provision in the region. And I think if you get that right in a place-based context, then it will be something that employers turn to. And employers have been telling us throughout the year it's exactly what they want. British Chamber of Commerce have got a commission that David sits on who are precisely saying we want this with this expanded support to help us with close to market innovation, and we're hearing that a lot from employers. So I think if you get it right within a joined up collaborative way that makes sense within the local context, I think it'll be something that employers turn to.
Thanks, Lewis. Any final thoughts, Olly, before we wrap up?
No, I think that's been an absolutely excellent session. I think kind of key points for me, that the funding one keeps coming up. The Four Nations theme is one that we're going to continue to support at Edge. This business centres idea, but really kind of taking that through the lens of really genuine collaboration between peers in colleges, ITPs, and then the wider sector in schools and HE, all kind of working together and building on each other's strengths. So thank you for hosting, and thank you for a great event, everyone.
Well, thank you to Edge for organising, and thanks to everyone on the panel and our two speakers for their thoughts this morning. And let's see what the Prime Minister has to tell us later on. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.